What does it mean to be a man and a musician? Is all music for everyone, or is there music that men should stick to playing? And as musicians, what good can they do, and what harm can they do? Musicians can be idols, role models, personalities we want to imitate. And popular music is a male-dominated area where the most admired male musicians can sometimes be seen as the most real men. Now, performers need to be talented, creative, confident, and these and many other traits go well with a manly persona. And we're going to explore what happens when the idea of the masculine musician gets to further extremes and gets a bit silly. But to start, what do people look for in a manly musician? Now, what people consider a man can be diverse, but even beyond typical traits like assertiveness and risk-taking, often a performer representing their manliness can come from any aspect of their identity. For example, in an interview with Lemmy of Motorhead comparing the Beatles to the Rolling Stones, he said that he always thought the Beatles were tougher and more manly because they were from a tougher area and they showed less respect to the establishment than the Stones did. That's not a personality trait directly. It just assumes that someone's tougher because of regional perceptions. I started with Lemmy's opinion because Lemmy was part of a huge shift in music, not just in the evolution of rock, punk and metal, but in how performers in these male-dominated spaces accentuated what they saw as important masculine traits. To them, rock stars should look rugged, play their instruments with either anger or nonchalance. Singers had to have rough voices, and this next one is a rare exception in music. You did not need to conform to traditional beauty standards. You could be ugly. And the emphasis on this kind of personality goes hand in hand with the music. In the evolution of rock music, the subgenres that owe their heritage to rock were allowed to sound less beautiful. Look at punk, for example. It's distorted but rough, uncomplicated but messy, just like the personalities that represent it. Even the rare female celebrity in this space had to take on that look, and these were all positive traits as long as they felt authentic. There is this perception that masculine is more real and traditional femininity is more fake. Think of caring about your appearance, covering your face in cosmetics, conforming to an authority figure. These are all seen as traditionally feminine traits. Rock music, especially when you look at punk and metal movements, were more authentic, was nonconformist, and the music expressed that beauty but not in a way that was perceived as beautiful. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the irony that nonconformist movements develop a culture where new members need to conform. Okay, that's long enough. So imagine performance personas lie on a scale, and the further you go up the scale, the more obviously you want to express this traits more common in men. The bolder, more reckless, more disagreeable you get. Before we see and hear what it's like when you go off the deep end of the scale, we can recontextualize it by going back on the scale. When you do that, you get what's known as soft masculinity. It's the kind of persona associated with boy bands. Softer features, cleaner, friendlier, often perceived as healthier, especially in spaces where traditional masculinity has been demonized. There are two stark differences that stand out on this end of the scale. Number one, it's not rock music, it's pop music. Which makes sense. Pop's portrayal of the ideal man, much like the music itself, is more acceptable to a wider audience. Important side note, I'm going to keep coming back to this idea that the music must match the performer's persona, and if the performer and their music are tied together, one cannot move without the other's permission. If you want to know the tonal clash that happens when the music and persona are mismatched, look no further than McFly's 2023 album Power to Play. It was a small but firm rebrand to a more rock-like sound and a punkier aesthetic. Here's a guitar pick I caught from Dougie when I saw them live. It says McFly on one side and soft rock up your bum on the other. I was really buying into it during the gig. But because they are a band with fans going back a long time, they eventually had to play It's All About You. And that completely broke the illusion. Oh, I thought, they haven't authentically shifted into the rock persona because they still care about this soft pop music. And I know they still care because they still play it. Do one or do the other. You can change character for an album, but when the music doesn't match, you're breaking character. The other thing you'll notice about soft masculinity in music is that the target audience for that music is much more likely to be women. So, If you thought that the uber-masculine tendencies were more for the purpose of attracting women, you're mostly mistaken. There's a perception among men that displays of traditional masculinity are mostly appreciated by other men and less so by women or society as a whole. So even when being attractive to women is part of the masculine persona, it's not seriously in aid of attracting women. Expressing manliness is less about romance and more about self-actualization or brotherhood. Men seeking out their space where they can embrace the parts of the gender that they love and need not worry about what other women think, which can be liberating, and with the wrong mediation, can be unhealthy. Yes, traditional masculine behaviour can discourage emotional expression, leading to poor mental health outcomes, especially when it becomes less about expressing your authentic self, and more about obsessing over showing your masculinity. Though I consider this more of a distortion of masculinity. But as we move off the absolute extreme end of the showy-offy manly musical scale, yes, we find more insecurity, but I feel we also find the cure for insecurity. When you obsess over acting like a man, it becomes simple and one-dimensional. Read also immaturity. But immaturity can be funny, and that is the primary joke of the band Ninja Sex Party. NSP has two members, Danny Sexbang, the cool confident rock star who dresses in bright shiny costumes, and Ninja Brian, who is silent, ultra-violent, and wears ninja pajamas. These are the opposite ends of the spectrum of what an 8-year-old boy will consider the coolest things in the world a man can be. I could even imagine them being marketed to young boys if their songs weren't so explicitly for adults. They are a comedy band, if that didn't come across, and the comedy in much of their music comes from exaggerating the negative stereotypes of men that can come from insecurity. Danny being obsessed with sex whilst paying no attention to the women around him and bragging and lying about his wealth, and Brian killing people. I call this ironic masculine because it's so obviously intended as a joke. This is clear because the punchline is often that they are not nearly as cool as they think they are. But again, what makes those jokes so cohesive is not the costumes or the lyrics, those are the surface level. None of this would work so well without the music, which evokes the rock and pop of the 1980s. In case that inspiration wasn't obvious enough, they have a series of cover albums that are mostly 80s pop hits. The centralized joke of the ironic masculine would work differently in other musical styles, because this musical style is very particular on the timeline of mainstream popular music. And it's also where NSP's idea of the hyperbolic masculine comes from. The idea of Ninja Sex Party as the ultimate men is not outdated just because it's immature and the audience are grown-ups, but because the shallow idea of manliness that's being played for laughs was cemented in the 1980s, particularly the obsession on this Americanized idea of what a ninja is. The 80s had this reputation for being the age of excess, especially in the US, the land of excess. However true it is, this idea is what remains in our cultural history, and it may be an incomplete picture, but in general, popular art is blended together to form the narrative of history. And this is the message left behind by the 1980s. The best people show off their excess. Their beauty, their strength, their money, their talent should all be front and centre. This was all true of the popular music and its musicians. NSP are there as reflections of both music and the forced masculine ideal that went together. Obviously, any idea that this is true masculinity is ridiculous because it's full of contradictions. As with any irony, you see contradictions everywhere. Immature songs for adult audiences. A confident frontman that really feels insecure. 1980s pop music in the present day. These contradictions are not subtle. They could be subtle, but we'll get on to what happens when it becomes a bit more subtle. But first, let's look at some examples to show that music is the pivotal factor that turns NSP from simple jokes about the hyperbolic masculine into a parody of the 80s ideal man. Example 1. Orgy for One is a song where the verses are formatted as a list, being very wordy, and each line making a completely different point before returning to the chorus. This is a common song form that you can see even in old folk music, but the rock pop music style makes it most reminiscent to me of We Didn't Start the Fire. Only instead of listing important historical events, Danny is listing excuses women gave for not wanting to have sex with him. Example 2. The song I Own a Car reflects the classic American love of cars, and its portrayal in popular music even predates the 1980s. Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run in '75 cemented the car as a symbol of freedom. But 3 years later, Grease made its car more an object to brag about and impress people, which is far more in line with NSP's purpose of using the car to show off. The only problem with showing off is that actually showing makes it harder to lie about what you're showing, and Danny shows off that not only is his car unimpressive, but he doesn't know anything about it. So in jokes about not actually being all that manly, we have being unappealing to women, and not knowing things men are expected to know about traditionally. But what about being a tough guy, being fighting fit and aggressive, which was a trope of 80s rock music, but may also be history's most consistent expectation of men, even in relatively peaceful societies? Well, Danny does get beaten up in the song Thunder and Lightning, but this is where his foil Ninja Brian steps in to make the joke that Danny can't. That joke being that actually very violent people are not at all fun to be around. In fact, it's terrifying. I got to experience this joke firsthand when I saw NSP live, and Brian glares at the audience throughout a song, and when he looks at me and tries to kill me with his eyes, I was genuinely unnerved, even while actually having a great time. It was a fun, safe place to play with the emotions and feel real negative emotions in the harmless setting of a joke, and that represents NSP's greatest achievement as a band. Ironic music is well placed to challenge cultural values by applying contradictions to well-known archetypal song forms, in this case 80s rock or pop. In NSP's case, it's a very obvious band for a very obvious joke, but it's only so obvious because it's so relevant. What separates the genders is something each of us can make sense of, and for many of us becomes something aspirational. The characters of NSP do something that can be very scary to admit, striving to attain their beloved ideal, and in every aspect, looking like a complete buffoon instead. Trying to achieve greatness so hard that you become the worst aspects of your desire, and if you personally try and fail, you can laugh at these men who tried the most and failed the hardest. But if you thought masculine values were never anything to find as praiseworthy, then you can laugh at this silly representation of masculine values. Now, what I've said about NSP from the start is that the joke is very hard to miss. It's designed to be unsubtle, so unless you're blind and paying no attention to the lyrics, you'll know that obviously no man seriously acts like this. Or do they? As the 1980s left their idea of the most masculine man behind, the 90s and the noughties rolled around, and the fashion for what pop culture wanted from men was lower key and subtler. So what happens to the obvious, ironic, silly man when it becomes less obvious? My next case study is Gunter. You may know him from Teeny Weeny String Bikini or his 2004 debut single Ding Dong Song. Personally, my seasonal playlist will always hold a place for Ding Dong Christmas Song. After just hearing about NSP, you may notice that he too is pretty laughable. He has a tight black shirt, super deep voice, surrounds himself with gorgeous women, pouts for the camera constantly, but the one thing that convinces me that this is an over-the-top joke rather than anything more genuine is the mustache, which is a permanent part of his costume. Personally, I have nothing against mustaches, but they are undeniably a symbol of dated ideas of superficial manliness. Even the SpongeBob movie was making this joke in 2004, the same year as Ding Dong Song was released. However, on the sliding scale between unironic hyperbolic masculine and silly ironic masculine, Gunter must sit in the middle, something like an ironic unironic man. I dub it the masculine unironic supercilious ironic caricature. The joke is hard to read. Compared to NSP, the fashion is not so obviously dated in 2004, manliness was not nearly as demonized as it has now become, and more importantly, his music does not mock himself. It empowers his ideals, and you could theoretically enjoy it at face value, zero irony needed. But it does mock someone or some group of people. The funniest thing about Gunter's music career is his 2013 song, I'm Not Justin Bieber, bitch. You could say he was a little late to the party for this joke, with Bieber's Baby being released in 2010, but I remember in 2013 Justin Bieber was still an easy target for constant mockery. He didn't look like the man like we expect our singers to look like men. Now, obviously he didn't because he wasn't actually a man, but he looked even younger than he actually was. Everyone knew he looked immature, but Of course he wasn't supposed to appeal to men. He had his own line of nail polish, for God's sake. Bieber was a completely straight-faced carrying out of something that to some people seemed silly, so yeah, it was okay to mock it. Gunter mirrored this popular sentiment and used it as a personal brag. Look at what the music industry wants you to think of as a man. He's so obviously not a man, just look at me for comparison. You may not love Gunter's idea of manliness, but you may prefer it to Bieber's. In the words of C.S. Lewis, the devil sends errors into the world in pairs of opposites. He relies on your extra dislike of one error to draw you gradually into the opposite. If you don't like Bieber, you may root for Gunter, even unironically. Here we must be careful. Silly as they both are, this is still one idea of what a male musician should be in conflict with another. But once again, comedy and music can help us play with emotions and ideas that may be harmful in a more serious environment. Maybe looking at the insult between these two equally unserious musicians can help us realise that one isn't objectively better than the other, and taking a side seriously is nonsensical. There are two main takeaways here. Firstly, that irony can be subjective. What is an obvious parody to one person might seem like an honest example to another. The reading is dependent on the reader's expectations and prejudices of what they're experiencing. Now, the other takeaway: there is no right way to be a male musician's performance persona, just as there is no right way to do music. Music will always be a reflection of the society it comes from, and performance identities will follow. If your culture's idea of an ideal man is a preacher, a charismatic and religious man standing alone and sharing his love with the crowd, then you get the kind of blues gospel frontman that Elvis evolved from, with appropriately Christian music. If the ideal is a free-spirited, uncaring man who makes it all look easy, then you get someone talented but detached. The influence musicians can have as role models, especially on teenagers, can be life-changing, which is why it's so important to rationalise and promote responsible, grounded thinking in those around us. There are as many kinds of musicians as there are kinds of people, and the music can help us understand our feelings, those people's feelings, and other people's feelings. We listen, we choose, and we express.